To the Art 103 students, raise your hands. It's their first gallery opening. All right. This happens every month. It's been happening every month for the last 40 years. So, I'd like to make a couple of announcements before we start. Next week, we will have our next reception in the gallery. It's by an exhibition by Sarah and Joseph Belknap, who this fall showed at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And then after spring break, just a heads up about two things. One is get your stuff ready for Opus and get ready to come to the senior crits and watch them strut their stuff. So I'd like to welcome Andrea Ferrigno. She is a professor of art at Knox College on the west side of the state. She did her undergraduate work at the Kansas City Art Institute and her graduate work in printmaking at the University of Iowa, which is, for as long as I can remember, and that's a fairly long time these days, the premier printmaking school in the country. And, welcome.
Thank you, and I wanted to thank you guys for inviting me out. I've had a great time working with the students today, and thank you for those who helped make the show as well. So kind of have notes, but trying to stick to them will be another story. So this is one of the last times I tried to write an artist statement. This was kind of the result of that, of kind of brainstorming and trying to lay out kind of a diverse network of ideas that I've been working within for quite some time. So I have a lot of just slides to move through, kind of take you on a visual journey of my kind of artistic meandering throughout the years. So this is a piece that's in the show today. This is actually a very early painting I did in undergrad, and one that I've never really quit thinking about. It was an interpretation of Monet's Cathedral. I was really interested in these ideas of impermanence, Monet trying to capture these fleeting moments. I was also just interested in the breakdown of space, and I've always kind of been interested in math and science in that regard. Little particles. So this is one that's stayed with me. As I kind of continued, I wanted to investigate more about kind of the structure of cathedral. I don't have any images of the prints that I made after this, but I started researching cathedral structures, discovered sacred geometry. I don't know if you guys have covered that or know of that, but I think a lot of students kind of have these grand aha moments and the universe suddenly makes sense to them. I got fairly obsessed with that, studying that, thinking about the relationship to the body as a way of generating form, as a way of understanding space and structure. I also have spent a lot of time with Paul Klee and spent a lot of time doing kind of studies like this here from Lawler's Sacred Geometry book. During my undergrad, which was at an art school, we did have literature and some math and science courses, and one was on topology. So this is kind of the study of nodes, space, kind of form as bubbles. So I'm kind of going through some early sources, then I'll move on to my work too. So this book, Formless User's Guide, Evelyn Waugh and Rosalind Krauss, kind of a dictionary of a lot of topics and ideas that always capture my attention, and I feel like I've read it a million times and don't ever quite get all of it, and keeps me occupied. The idea of the pulse, Rosalind Krauss talks about with film theory is kind of this reciprocity of energy, kind of a way I like to think about art too, as Gilles Deleuze talks about art as this kind of transference of energy. And I think, as life changes and as I let my work kind of directly respond to that need and that energy. So as you see in the show, kind of a diverse body of work that have these still kind of underlying currents that I try to keep open to being allowed to kind of express or work in the way that I need to. I found this image here on the right when I was putting this together, and I think it's from a Methods and Theories art history book, and I just thought it was really funny how they've got this, category for subjectively determined work, materially determined, not materially determined, and not subjectively determined. And I, kind of felt like I wanted to be in the middle of that, or be able to, not just be in one category. And I think most of these artists here too. So another influence, someone I'm thinking more of lately is Emma Klimt, kind of visionary work of hers, kind of been on the sidelines of art history, but I think it's beginning a lot more recognition. And Yoko Ito is the one on the left. Kind of this slow, quiet space. This was a still from a video that I did towards the end of my undergrad, and I was starting to experiment with sound and how sound moves particles. I had all these glass beads that I put on a speaker, and they vibrated and moved, and I did a series of videos and projections based on that. I was also thinking about anatomic space and how all these little cells would fit together, and was spending a lot of time looking at things that are microscopes. After undergrad, I had a few years off in between undergrad and grad school. And so the next couple images are symbolic of a lot of work that I did in that time, which is kind of very meditative, very structured, really interested in the circle. It's kind of this primordial form, it's very open-ended and ambiguous. So this is kind of symbolic of my paintings, and was also, I've always, working kind of back and forth, works on paper and paintings. And while I wasn't doing much with printmaking at this time, because I didn't have a studio with press, I think there's something here kind of in printmaking space where you kind of have these layers of, I kind of think of printmaking as you work with these kind of membranes of space where you're building kind of thin layers out. So this was an early piece that I did in grad school that actually became the template for some of the pieces in the show. So this was just all hand drawing on paper, markers. I was kind of interested in this very structured, tight space, and working that over laying a system that was kind of falling apart, this thing that kind of decomposing. So these are lithography. I was also thinking of the bleaching of coral with my colors. So this was kind of a series. When I've done these silk screens, I set up a lot of colors. I don't do a ton with additioning, with making the same set of work, but rather kind of thinking of seriality and building and working kind of intuitively with color. And so my work's kind of very tight and structured, and I always try to break out of that. So this couple next pieces are ones that I'm continuing to think about that kind of break that rigid structure a little bit, with still having nods to that, trying to make a mess. I'm spending a lot of time looking at natural forms. I think a lot of my interest in science is from the natural world and that kind of aesthetic experience of being in nature, and how meaningful that is, and how driven by this curiosity and kind of wonder of looking. So I was looking at a piece of brain coral, I think, and started kind of doing this systematic mark that I'll talk about a little bit. I was in a aesthetics course and thinking about, Plato talks about art as mimicry, or kind of ideal art as mimicking form. So I was thinking of this idea, but instead of trying to mimic a form, I was trying to think of mimicking movement. And I was looking at a lot of images of particle collision and things sliding around under a microscope, and was trying to mimic that. One, that they're computer kind of replications, and try to hold my own to a computer in that way and be a dialogue with that digital aspect of things. So these are very refined. I've kind of always had, my early work has always kind of been driven towards a refinement, subtlety, been criticized of elegance. It's a bad thing to some people. And so I was trying to take this and really then engage physicality with it. I was interested in, this idea of material trace, of how, you move, and this is this movement of evidence of kind of time, and I wanted to engage the body, so the scale grew, which is kind of my physical engagement with this work, with bearing down with graphite, and racing and really wrestling with these. So this is kind of my main body of work for a while. It got kind of comfortable, and I think that's how a lot of times I'll kind of switch modes. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes I get a different idea, sometimes I feel like I understand a system too well and I need to kind of throw a wrench in it or take a different turn. As well as kind of working this way as kind of mapping, creating this field of space, creating this chaos, and then trying to map out that space. I began kind of excavating forms from that space and then distilling the kind of web to these forms. So these are kind of examples of stuff from my sketchbook as well. Like the one on the left, I'd be looking at a lot of natural forms. I think of this idea of gleaning. I think a lot of my graduate work was done gleaning information from science and from studies of nature. It's really inspired by like Ernst Haeckel, who did a lot of microscopic studies, and this kind of way that through art we can understand the world. It's a way, like an empirical understanding that art allows us to kind of move through information freely and understand the world in a different way. This is kind of done at the same time as those early particle collision studies. Kind of the beginning of this genesis of this system here that was started off as kind of quiet, refined, more structured, thinking of kind of DNA strands, undulating light to dark. Thinking of Agnes Martin as well as kind of stripes and breaks. And again, this kind of transformed. And I like this kind of moire effect of this other pattern emerging. And there's still kind of this field. I feel like, I have this like horror vacuum I want to fill this space. So I challenged myself to think more of, leaving open spaces to allow these forms to become more irregular. This one started to allude. I didn't set out with the intention of alluding to a figure in this one, but it started to really, speak to a female form here. So I started thinking a lot about systems and the body still, and just looking a lot at Silhouette and thinking of his ideas of conceptual art, and he works a lot with systems to generate his work, and looking at his kind of principles of conceptual art. So he talks about, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. So I wrote kind of rebuttals to his different statements, because I appreciate his work a lot, and I like that way he has those rules, but I really want to allow myself more risk and more play, and so set up this system, but then I'm going to break the rules and allow myself to be engaged with the work as it develops. And so part of my system was this mark making and thinking about, these are body size, so I was relating them to kind of parts of my bodies, each form kind of growing off of the other form. This one kind of mirroring out. So the principle would be talking about avoiding subjectivity, and kind of high modernism and minimalism is wanting to avoid subjectivity. And I want that experience to be allowed for. I want those freedoms to make their way into my work. So these are some examples of lithography, taking this language into print, printed over paper. These are kind of similar to some of the pieces in the show too that became condensed and and then kind of the one with Silhouette is wanting to engage the mind of the viewer rather than the eye or the emotions, and I really challenge that, and I want to engage the eye, I want to engage the perceptual as well as allow for the emotional. It's part of my drive to make work, just for a sense of scale. Okay, so I've got this couple Mother Teresa pieces in the show. If you haven't seen those, so I'll kind of explain those a little bit. I was working, doing these kind of tracings, extrapolating information from a lot of visual information from natural forms. Kind of had a life event. Picked up this Time magazine, and I grew up Catholic, so kind of like Mother Teresa, this is comforting for me. And so this was her kind of head that I traced, and I think it was for me, her dark night of the soul, and the fact that she persevered with her faith without kind of feeling that, kind of really resonated with me. So in an effort to translate that last drawing to go large, I started this. And I got to this point, and I put it up, and I stood back, and I realized that was it. It was just done. Kind of thinking of this as Paul Klee, going for a walk, taking a line for a walk in a different way. You have a sense of time, rosary beads. Each little mark was kind of walked across the page. And so this is kind of a thread of work that maybe I'm doing, kind of try to do once a year. These are very large too, so like my size. And I'm also working color back into these systems. Examples similar to the ones at the show, thinking of translating this kind of processes into printmaking. So if some of you are in the workshop today, this is similar all techniques that we use today, where I was just wiping away, inking up the plate, wiping away the ink. This was printed, I think, in 2 layers with that. This was then taking those drawings that had gotten pretty large, maybe here, and going, larger than my size. And again, like trying to pull out information. And I think in this case too, I intended to kind of map that space out, and then these kind of forms emerged. And so it's kind of losing those dots. This is kind of another piece from that. We actually found a mole outside of our studio, and he was kind of flailing around with their giant paws, and he died shortly after. So this was my homage to the mole, and kind of this elegant, and there's something violent about it. So these are some images from one of my shows at Iowa. So I've got all these different kind of conversations going, and working like I did in this show to kind of bring some of these conversations together. Maybe some of these images that are more easily digestible, kind of putting them together and creating a foil for them. I had some little objects on shelves and some kind of physical things that related to the imagery as well. I'm kind of a close-up because the paper is really physically torn and scratched. That's my stone carving. Found rock. My friend told me it was a badger claw fossil, but I don't know if that's true. Those 2 things that not equal the other drawing. This is so as John knows from our kind of stories, I was adopted and was reunited with my biological family. I grew up Catholic, and when I met my biological father shortly after, I was participating in sweat lodges, and he was very much following a Native American tradition of spirituality. And so I was kind of pairing those things side by side. This was actually, he lives out on a farm, and I was collecting these feathers because they reminded me of the marks I was making. And he offered me this as a gift. He salted a rooster hide. I guess it was a very mean rooster, so. Okay, so I did painting, drawing, and printmaking in Iowa. Actually, I started in the painting and drawing program. I finished, and then printmaking invited me to stay on and continue with them, and offered me a teaching thing for a year, and to continue to take classes. So I was kind of switching gears. I switched from this kind of large work in a large studio to downsizing and focusing on print. I was also wanting to say something more specific. I thought I was getting a little esoteric and out there, and wanting something concrete. So I started working with language, kind of mirroring it, unfolding it, thinking a way I could kind of bury meaning within work. And I was kind of interested in how this kind of way of using language, they kind of became characters themselves. And the same with then using systems more like this, that those kind of forms kind of became kind of glyph-like, which I think is similar to some of the earlier pieces. I think I go back and forth of wanting to be loud and expressive with my work and wanting to be quiet. And so this is, I think of these different kind of systems I have going and kind of always trying to weave them back into each other. I started making and still am making these kind of small oil paintings of layering systems and how these things, this becomes, 'cause it starts to hint at a thing that you could recognize without quite arriving there. And really thinking more about color too, more precisely. I think there's something with just, ways colors subtly shift that evokes some sense of time and color and their psychology. I'm kind of gleaning my own memory for the way that I'd maybe fuse what I'm saying with this text and color. So this is an image from my last show at Iowa, where I was having kind of some of these larger images, these smaller paintings. I had this large painting laid out on the floor, and a professor of mine at the time had this little hand sculpture, like a garden thing. I liked that kind of kitschy aspect to it with this bird, which, side note, but I have kind of a side project where I paint birds if I get stuck and I have a great fondness for them. And I like this kind of nod to the spiritual and also maybe a nod to Duchamp and the fountain, and it bubbled. It was quite lovely. Anyway, so I was putting this show together, and somebody had unpacked their whole studio right outside the gallery. It was almost obscuring the entrance, and this deer was left there, so I put it in the show. So I like to be open to those things. There is no taxidermy around here, so. And this is a process called foil imaging, which was invented at the University of Iowa by Virginia Myers, and it's kind of hard to explain, but you layer these it's kind of like silkscreen, but with material. And you layer through adhesive these kind of layers of foil. It's actually the stuff you'd use on business cards, but just kind of trying to take it to a fine art purpose. And so I just was using all these kind of as many mandala forms as I could find and layer them. So kind of moving on to more recent, I think, still following the same thread of my story. And again, back to this sound, I'm always interested in how this kind of juxtaposition of stillness and motion, and really think music is probably just the best form of art. I kind of wish I was a musician, but I'm not. So this is, on the left, is studies by Ernst Chladni, who studied the structure of sound. Vibration. You'd set up a metal plate, strum a violin bow across the side. Depending on where you pinch it, these different patterns emerge. So this was kind of in a small intaglio. Some of you worked with that today. Kind of scratching into the plate was my kind of study of those, interpretation of those patterns. So you can see they kind of mirror. So I got a function generator, which is kind of used in physics classrooms to demonstrate how waves form in these patterns emerge out of that wave particle duality. I was interested in working from these as something that was found. I didn't make these. I could set this thing, but this exists kind of outside of me. I like thinking of it kind of stamping off footprints. So I've been kind of creating these patterns of sound. There's a couple small prints of this that are kind of more studies at this point for what I hope will be a larger project. This is kind of a close-up of, you set this thing, it makes a really obnoxious noise, and the sand bounces around and finally settles on a pattern. And so I've been making collograph plates with that, so I ink up with gel medium a plate and stamp off the sand and then seal that up, and then I've been printing these, so those little guys in there, that's kind of how those came about. Experimenting with this too, kind of drawing some of these patterns out, putting pigment down and vibrating that, and letting that kind of land where it will. I'm really interested in, I think there's a level of chance here, so kind of John Cage and his chance operations and allowing that to enter my work. So that's kind of similar to the one, not the one of them that is in the show now. My goal is to kind of go large and start to tile some of these together and respond, see what happens. It's kind of more recent drawing, responding way, kind of beginning layers is one of those Chladni patterns, and kind of responding to that, kind of mapping that information. I like to switch materials as well. I think sometimes working with the chalk pastels, I can start moving really fast. Working with an oil pastel is going to slow you down and make me move really slow. And the different read that happens. Some examples of that. This must have been feeling kind of loud too with my color. More recent painting, something's shifting in painting. These kind of new forms are emerging. I think while I had these kind of conceptual ideas about my work's kind of always a little bit ahead of me, and I'm trying to catch up with it a little bit. So I think this is one that I'm interested in, but I can't quite talk about it so clearly. And so in this piece, which is in the show also, just think of these things, these particles, obviously they're moving, and underneath that I was writing in cursive and mapping that out. So kind of trying to reintroduce that language component as well. It was just an A-H-H scream. And my work really actually, since I came out here, I did a workshop with you guys last summer and went off to Vermont Studio Center and did a residency, and it was just so nice to have a full day to work on a drawing and nothing else. And my work has shifted, I think, as I feel like there's so much loud going on in the world, and it's kind of I've really been more interested in the quiet and small pieces lately. I'll be curious how this kind of opens back up too. I think that's kind of my work starts small and refines, and then I'll loosen up. And these are small, similar to the ones in the show. And kind of starting to think about introducing color as well and flattening back out some of those planes. And that was the last slide. So, happy to answer questions. Yes?
Do you set rules for yourself when you're making something?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, if I set rules for myself when I make something. I think in some works like this, that the only elements I can use is this curve, a linear line, and those kind of mapping. So I limit what I can work with. I was only going to work with graphite in that system. Something like this one, I was very much, there's this pattern, this piece of paper has this kind of embossment of subtle linear patterns in it from when the sheet of paper was made. So I was going to just follow that here to here. I was very rule-based in this, kind of alternating even which one. And so I think actually most of these systems I work with start very rigid and then open up. So I could say my rules become less defined, and then I kind of have to rein it back in. That was probably here in these kind of hybrid where all these forms could only exist like this, and they're all undulating light to dark. And it's hard to get the sense from this, but they're also very physical too. It's all mechanical pencil. Kind of crazy and obsessive. Acknowledge that point.
If you're too shy to ask a question now, you can talk to Andrea one-on-one in the gallery.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about the work directly, process, thoughts. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.